Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard was sent to Kabul in 2003 to take command of the British forces in Afghanistan. Richard, thank you for your time this evening. We've been talking about sort of Zelensky's daring and so far highly successful incursion, 8 days now into Russian territory. I wonder what your perception of it is, because they've got a choice now. Do they hold their position? Do they withdraw? What do you think is the best tactical strategy for Zelensky?
Well, I think very wisely, neither Zelensky or Shersky, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, have not announced what their strategy is. So we don't know what they exactly intend to do, whether they do intend this to be simply a raid to disrupt and demoralize the Russians by seizing what I think is about 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory now, and then withdraw, or whether it's to actually hold on to the ground there, advance even further, maybe be reinforced by additional troops. We don't know. None of us know what it's all about, and it's actually in some ways quite mystifying. I think it would be optimistic in my view to expect Ukraine to hold on to all of that ground and perhaps even more for a long period. The Russians they haven't yet, after a week, really got their act together. They will get their act together. They will attack this incursion with, I think, tremendous force. Whether the Ukrainians will be driven back, we don't know. Whether more reinforcement will come up, we don't know either. I think one comment I would make on it is that Zelensky has appealed to Great Britain to allow his forces to use Storm Shadow long-range missiles to support this incursion that has been made by his forces. And
just explain what those weapons are to us.
Right, these are very long-range weapon systems that can strike, for example, the Russian airfields that are used to counterattack against the Ukrainians, strike supply depots, strike forces coming forward over a very long range. And the same goes for other systems that have been supplied to Ukraine, like ATACMS. Trouble is that despite being asked by Zelensky to allow these weapons to be used on Russian territory, our Prime Minister and President Biden have both said no. That could make a big difference. So at present, the restrictions are that they can only be used to attack Russian forces who have actually moved onto Ukrainian territory. I think that is very short-sighted and in many ways cowardly to deprive the Ukrainians of this extra resource which could allow them to hold out even longer on Russian territory.
Afghan soldiers who served alongside British Special Forces and have since come to the UK. Well, many of them, now they're here, are struggling to find work because they're not able to join the army until they've lived here for 5 years. They are some of the most highly skilled and daring soldiers in Afghanistan. They'd been trained by British troops, but often they are now unemployed, working as cleaners, taxi drivers for takeaway delivery companies.
You could argue there's a special case maybe for the Afghans. You could maybe compare them to Gurkhas. I think I'm right in saying that Gurkha soldiers serving in the British Army don't have to become British citizens first. I think it's unusual that they do. So maybe there's an exception that could be applied there as well. Perhaps even they could join the Gurkhas. I don't know. Gurkhas is pretty much of a closed shop organisation, but I suppose anything's possible. I would say I don't see a particularly strong recruiting case for this. I don't think we're talking about large numbers who would make any real difference to our recruiting situation, which is not due to a lack of people wanting to join the armed forces or willing to join the armed forces. It's due to a system that simply does not work, and that's what I think does need to be addressed. And I'd also add that that obviously there are different standards and procedures involved in being a British soldier than in the Afghan army. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be a direct fit for the British army because you served in the Afghan armed forces. And in saying that, I'm not in any way questioning the courage, the fighting spirit, and the other things of Afghan soldiers. I've seen them in action. I know how extraordinarily brave and courageous they are, but it's not exactly the same thing as required from a British soldier.
Yeah, you can. Well, some of them who are quoted in the article are saying, "Look, I spent all my life in the military. To switch it off and join the civilian world is difficult. I'd love to wear my uniform. I'd love to serve others. I'd 100% join the British Army because I love it." This is one man who led nearly 9,000 Afghan Special Forces units in their fight against the Taliban. Presumably, the British Army would, that would be an asset recruiting someone like that.
Yeah, as someone who's had military service, we have many people join the British Army who have served in other armies, like, for example, the Australian Army and other Commonwealth armies before coming to the British forces. And generally speaking, they are a great asset. So, yeah, I wouldn't deny that they would be an asset to the British forces if they've served in action in Afghanistan.
You talk about recruitment. I think Larissa's analysis is that this would be affecting about 30 or 40 Afghans who would sign up if the rules changed. You said actually that the problem was the system at large. Can you elaborate a bit more on what you meant?
Yeah, I've spoken to many young men and women who've tried to join the armed forces, who want to be soldiers, but just can't get in. And the recruiting system, I'm not saying this applies across the board, but I've heard it too often to dismiss it as being a mere anomaly, but the recruiting system does seem to be almost designed to stop people joining the forces. There used to be, and I'm not saying let's go back to the good old days of recruiting officers in the high street, but that made a big difference. People could actually meet a soldier face to face and go through with that soldier the concerns that a recruit might have, an applicant might have about the forces, and have those concerns dispelled, and then just be able to sit down and sign up and join. You can't do that anymore in the vast majority of cases. You've got to go through a very complicated computerized system. And at no point, certainly in the early stages, do you actually come face to face with a real life soldier. You're talking probably to a recruiter on the phone or by the internet who probably a civilian, never served in the forces, doesn't know anything about it, can't answer all questions. And that's part of it. And then, there's a whole IT system that doesn't really seem to me to be fit for purpose. And, I've known young men and women who tried to join, and it's taken them maybe a year. They've been told, okay, you can join in a year's time or 6 months' time. A young person who wants a job isn't going to wait for 6 months or a year to join. They're going to find something else to do in the meantime. And it's that system. It's all about saving money. The outsourced recruiting of the armed forces is designed to save money. It's saved money, but it hasn't achieved recruiting. And I think that's an area that the Labour government really does need to tackle if it wants to do something about recruiting for the armed forces.
So you'd say actually the problem is not that there's a lack of people who are willing to sign up. It's that the infrastructure to get them in quickly doesn't exist.
Absolutely. And when I was serving, a long time ago now, but when I was serving, my battalion was very, very strongly undermanned, very seriously undermanned. And we dealt with that ourselves by sending young soldiers out onto the streets, talking to potential applicants, encouraging them to join. And it's remarkable what an effect that had, the face-to-face contact with somebody in uniform. Even young people who never thought about joining the army before were, before too long, in many cases, signing up and becoming very good soldiers. But I suspect that the system today, with all the bureaucracy surrounding it, doesn't probably allow that kind of approach. But it's certainly possible to make up the shortfall in numbers by, I think, sorting out the recruiting system. I'm convinced, I don't have polling data, I don't have any other evidence for it, but from my own experience and my own knowledge and talking to many young people today, I'm convinced there are plenty who want to join the armed forces, and we wouldn't have a recruiting shortage. The other area that does, of course, need to be addressed as well, which was mentioned by your defence correspondent there, is people leaving the forces. And too many people are leaving the forces. Why is that? Because the terms and conditions of service, the way they're treated, is often not good enough. And that needs to be addressed. That needs to be looked at. They need to be paid more. They need to be looked after better in order to encourage them to stay in. Because, of course, it's far more cost effective to keep a soldier in the army who's served maybe for 4 years, to keep him for another 4 years, rather than recruit someone new.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that from personal experience. My boyfriend's an army doctor. I mean, the chaos that is wrought on their life and their loved ones and family and friends, and the difficulties it is of having a sort of ordinary life outside of the army is quite difficult. And for many of his colleagues and contemporaries have just said, do you know what, I can't really run a normal life alongside this job, so I have to give it up. And I know that anecdotally, but it's something you've obviously seen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It happens a lot of the time. And if there is that disruption, yes, the army life or the armed forces life is not for everybody. It's a different way of living. You have to want to do it, unless, of course, you're conscripted and forced to serve, which doesn't happen these days. But you have to want to do it. But even if you do want to do it, there are disruptions that perhaps you never expected and sacrifices you have to make. You have to be ready to work whenever you're required. Sometimes weekend leave or other leave cancel without notice. You have to be prepared for all of that and the disruptions to family life, etc. And therefore, really, you should be well compensated for doing that. People can't really be expected, I don't think, if they can go outside and find another job relatively easily today, I don't think they can be expected to withstand all of the pressures and the disruptions of service life unless they're very well compensated for it. So that's, I think again, it's like the recruiting thing I mentioned. The terms of service, the way the compensation overall, not just pay that soldiers receive and sailors and airmen receive, I think, has been steadily eroded over many years by a shortage of funds.
And, interestingly, the army don't go on strike. They can't go on strike. So we've been talking about strikes over the last 2 years or so. They haven't featured.